The fires of Meduseld's golden hall cast long shadows across the stone floor, their golden light dancing over the ancient tapestries that tell the story of Rohan, a land forged in courage and bound by the whispers of history. Can you hear it? The wind rushing over the endless plains, carrying echoes of hoofbeats and the songs of warriors long gone. This is the heart of Middle-earth, where the Rohirrim carved their home from the wild, and where every blade of grass seems to remember their name. Wherever you're listening from tonight, whether the stars are just rising or the dawn is hours away, we'd love to know what time is it for you. Let us know in the comments below, and let's begin this journey together, back to a time when the fate of a kingdom rested on the edge of a sword. Picture this: a king stands alone in his hall, his hand resting on a map so worn by time that the borders seem to blur. Theoden, son of Thengel, knows the weight of his crown, not just as ruler, but as the keeper of Rohan's memory. The plains outside may seem peaceful under the moonlight, but they hold secrets. The very earth beneath his feet remembers the thunder of horses, the clash of spears, and the desperate hope of a people who refuse to fade into legend. This isn't just a story of battles and kings. It's a tale of survival, of a land that became a home because someone dared to fight for it. Close your eyes for a moment and let the wind guide you. Can you smell the crisp air of the Amin Muil, or feel the tremor of the ground as riders gallop across the fields of the Eastfold? Rohan's history isn't written in ink. It's etched into the land itself, in the ruins of forgotten watchtowers and the songs sung by firelight. Tonight, we'll walk beside Theoden as he traces the paths of his ancestors, from the first daring ride of Eorl the Young to the dark days when shadows crept ever closer to the White Mountains. This is more than a bedtime story. It's an invitation to step into a world where every shadow has a story, and every whisper on the wind is a thread in the tapestry of Middle-earth. So settle in and let the tale of Rohan carry you away. The story of Rohan truly begins with a single ride, a journey that would shape the fate of Middle-earth for centuries to come. Eorl the Young, barely more than a boy by the reckoning of his people, sat astride his great horse, his breath misting in the cold northern air as he listened to the message from Gondor. The call for aid was desperate. The Balchoth, a savage tide of invaders, threatened to overrun the southern kingdom. Some among the Eothaiod counseled caution. Their own lands were far from danger, their people safe in the northern vales. But Eorl's heart burned with a fire no logic could quench. He gathered his riders, not just warriors but families, herds, and all they held dear, and turned their horses southward. It was a gamble that would either doom them or forge a legend. The journey itself was a trial, a winding path through treacherous lands where shadows seemed to cling to the hills. Yet the Eothaiod rode on, their hooves pounding like a drumbeat of defiance. When they finally reached the field of Celebrant, the battle was already raging. Gondor's forces were outnumbered, their lines crumbling. But Arel did not hesitate. With a cry that echoed across the plains, he led his horsemen into the fray, their charge cutting through the enemy like a blade through silk. The Balchoth, who had never faced the fury of the Northmen's cavalry, broke and fled. In that moment, Arel earned more than victory. He won the gratitude of Gondor, and with it, a kingdom. The gift of Calenardhin was vast, a land of rolling plains and rugged hills, but it was far from empty. Though Gondor's stewards called it abandoned, the earth itself seemed to whisper warnings. Ruins of forgotten watchtowers dotted the landscape, and at night, strange lights flickered in the distant mountains. Eorl knew his people would have to carve their future from this wild land, but first, they had to name it. He stood before his people, the wind tugging at his cloak, and spoke the word that would define them forever. Rohan, no longer wanderers, no longer guests. This was their home now, the land of the Horse Lords. Yet even as they raised their first halls and set their herds to graze, a question lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. The Balchoth had been defeated, but darker things stirred in the shadows of the White Mountains. Whispers spoke of an ancient evil, a presence buried deep beneath the earth, waiting. The land had been given freely, but it would not be tamed without a fight. Eorl's people had won their kingdom, now they would have to defend it. The hill rose proud and solitary from the plains, its slopes green, even in winter, as if the land itself had chosen this place. Eorl stood at its summit, the wind pulling at his hair like an impatient ally, and knew what must be done. Here, he said, pressing his palm to the earth, we will build a hall that will stand as long as the mountains do. His people, still weary from their long journey, exchanged glances, some hopeful, others uneasy. They had always been riders, free as the wind, their homes little more than tents and timber. But a king cannot rule from a saddle. The work began at dawn, the ringing of axes and the creak of ropes filling the air. Trees from the distant Firion wood were felled and dragged across the plains, their trunks carved into pillars as broad as a man's embrace. Women and children mixed clay for the daub, while elders whose hands had known only reins now learned the weight of mallets and chisels. There were whispers, of course, murmurs that this was folly, that the old ways were being forgotten. One gray-bearded rider even spat at the ground before Eorl's feet. "We are not farmers," he growled. "We do not burrow into the earth like badgers." But the king's answer was firm. "We are not burrowing," he said. "We are rising," and rise they did. Beam by beam, stone by stone, Meduseld took shape, its golden roof catching the sun like a crown upon the hill. The hall was more than shelter. It was a promise. Inside, the walls bore tapestries woven with the history of the Yothiad, from their first days in the north to the thunder of their charge at Celebrant. At its center stood Eorl's high seat, carved from a single oak, its arms shaped like rearing horses. Here, he would dispense justice, settle disputes, and bind his people to new laws. No longer would disputes be settled by the swiftest blade or the loudest voice. The mark would have order, even if it chafed like a new saddle. Yet for all its grandeur, Meduseld could not silence every doubt. The riders who patrolled the borders still glanced back at the hall with narrowed eyes, as if it were a cage rather than a beacon. And when Eorl's son, Brigo, took the throne after his father's passing, the murmurs grew louder. He was born in a house, not under the open sky, the old warriors muttered. What does he know of the wind's wisdom? The land was still wild. After all, wolves howled in the foothills, and rumors spoke of shapes seen beyond the Entwash, things that walked on two legs but were not men. The strength of Rohan would not be measured by its halls alone, but by the hearts of those who called it home. Years rolled like the endless grasses of the plains, and with each generation, the memory of the Yothiad's wandering days grew fainter. The children of Edoras knew no life but this, the smell of hay in the summer, the sound of the great horn calling the muster, the sight of Meduseld's golden roof gleaming against storm clouds. Yet the past has a way of whispering back when least expected. The descendants of Arel would learn that a kingdom built on legend must sometimes defend itself anew, not just with swords, but with the unbroken spirit of those first riders who dared to call a strange land home. The winter came early that year, biting into the plains of Rohan with teeth sharper than any blade. Helm Hammerhand, broad-shouldered and grim, stood atop the walls of the Hornburg, his breath misting in the frigid air as he watched the Dunlending host gather below. They came not as raiders, but as an army, their torches flickering like angry stars in the gathering dusk. Their chieftain, Fracca's son, had sworn vengeance for lands he claimed were stolen, a grievance nursed for generations. Helm's advisors urged caution, whispered of negotiation, but the king's hands, already calloused from a lifetime of war, clenched into fists. This land was bought with Eorl's blood, he said, his voice like stone, grinding against stone. We do not bargain with it. The siege began not with a roar, but with a slow, suffocating silence. The Dunlendings cut off every road, every stream, until the Hornburg became an island in a sea of enemies. Inside the fortress, the people of Rohan huddled together, their bellies hollow, their breath visible in the unrelenting cold. Children stopped crying, not from comfort, but from exhaustion. The king's own son, Haleth, fell first, not to a sword, but to the creeping sickness that thrived in the frost. They buried him in the snow, for the earth was too hard to dig. Still, Helm refused to yield. Each night, he strapped on his great fur cloak and vanished into the storm, returning at dawn with his fists bloodied and his enemies whispering of a ghost who walked the snows. The legends say he fought barehanded in the end, his sword lost, his helm discarded. The Dunlendings swore they saw him towering in the blizzard, his laughter rolling like thunder as he broke their lines with nothing but his rage. But even a king's strength is no match for hunger. When the thaw finally came, they found Helm frozen at his post, his body upright, his eyes still open, as if daring death itself to look away. The Dunlendings, though victorious, did not cheer. They crossed themselves and retreated, leaving the Hornburg to the crows and the echoes. Yet from that bitter winter, something unexpected took root. The Rohirrim, scattered and broken, began to return. They spoke of Helm's defiance not as a defeat, but as a beacon. A man who could face death with his hands alone could teach them how to face survival. Slowly, stubbornly, they rebuilt not just their homes, but their spirit. The land itself seemed to remember, for the springs ran clearer that year, and the grass grew greener where Helm's blood had fallen. His name passed into song, not as a lament, but as a challenge. Hammerhand, who held fast when the world itself seemed to crumble. And though the Dunlendings would return, though shadows would gather again, the people of Rohan would remember. A kingdom could be broken, but so long as one rider remained, the mark would endure. The snows had barely melted when Freiloff rode into Edoras, the hooves of his warhorse churning the mud of a kingdom that had nearly been erased. Helm's nephew was not a man of grand speeches. His face still bore the scars of the long winter's hunger, his cloak stitched from the tattered banners of the fallen. But when he dismounted before Meduseld's splintered doors, the people knew the Hammerhand's blood still ran hot. The Dunlendings, grown complacent in their occupation, had not expected the wrath that came at dawn. Freiloff's warriors struck like a storm from the mountains, their swords singing the same song their ancestors had sung at Celebrant, and this time they did not fight alone. Gondor's banners fluttered among the Rohirrim that day, their silver stars bright against the soot-stained walls. The steward Syrian had not forgotten the oath sworn centuries before, when Arel saved his land and Calenardhin became Rohan. Yet gratitude alone did not send Gondor's spears north. The enemy at their own gates, the shadow in the east, had grown teeth. A weakened Rohan was a vulnerability neither kingdom could afford. Together, they drove the Dunlendings back across the Isen, but the victory feast that night was a quiet thing. The mead tasted of ashes, the laughter of children too rare a sound. Freiloff walked the halls of Meduseld after the last fires burned low, his fingers tracing cracks in the pillars where axes had bitten deep. Rebuilding would take more than timber and stone. The Dunlendings had not just stolen grain, they had sown distrust. Whispers slithered through the villages. Why had Gondor waited so long to aid them? Was Roh, and merely a shield for the south, to be discarded when the danger passed? The new king knew the answer lay not in words, but in deeds. At his coronation, he placed Syrian's gift, a dagger with a hilt of white gemstone, upon the high seat. A knife can cut two ways, he told his people. To fear the hand that offers it is to bleed alone. The years that followed were a delicate dance of diplomacy and defiance. Freiloff rebuilt Edoras, yes, but he also sent riders to patrol the Gap of Rohan, where Gondor's watch had grown thin. He welcomed Gondorian envoys with open halls, yet refused to kneel when they spoke of tribute. The balance was fragile, a blade's edge between alliance and servitude, but in the markets of Aldburg, where merchants from both realms bartered, something unexpected took root: friendship. A Gondorian blacksmith taught a Rohirrim boy to forge a sword that would not shatter in the cold. A healer from Lossarnac saved a horse lord's daughter with herbs from the southern valleys. The people, scarred but stubborn, remembered what their rulers sometimes forgot, that trust, like grass after fire, grows back one blade at a time. Yet even as the kingdom healed, the wind carried warnings. Hunters spoke of strangers in the brown lands, clad in robes the color of dried blood. The herds in the eastfold grew skittish, as if they sensed something watching from the darkened eaves of Fangorn. And in Gondor's towers, the beacons stood ready, their wood dry as bone. Freiloff, standing atop the rebuilt walls of Edoras, would often turn his gaze eastward, where the stars seemed to flicker like guttering candles. The peace he had won was real, but so was the storm gathering beyond the horizon. The Dunlendings had been a wound. What came next would be a test of fire. The air in Meduseld had grown thick with the scent of burning herbs, a cloying sweetness that clung to the tapestries and dulled the once bright gold of the hall. Theoden slumped in his high seat, his fingers loose around the armrests, as if even the weight of his own hands was too much to bear. The whispers had done their work well, not the hiss of enemies at the gates, but the soft, insidious words of Grima Wormtongue, dripping like poison into the king's ears night after night. "You are weary, Lord," he murmured, smoothing the fur-lined collar of Theoden's robe. "The world beyond these walls is too harsh for an aging heart." And so the king sat, while beyond Edoras, The borders of Rohan frayed like old rope. The first raids came at dusk, swift and brutal. Orcs, their yellowed tusks gleaming in the firelight, swept down from the Amin Mule, torching farmsteads and driving off herds. Wild men from Dunland followed, their faces painted with ash, howling curses in a tongue that had not been heard in the Mark since Helm's day. Theodred, the king's only son, rode out again and again, his sword arm growing heavier with each skirmish. At council, his voice rang clear. "Father, we must muster the Eords, seal the fords." But Theoden only waved a trembling hand. The boy frets over shadows. Grima sighed, pouring another cup of wine. The land is vast. A few lost sheep are no reason to rouse the entire kingdom. Yet the land was vast, and its silence grew louder. Villages emptied overnight, their people fleeing eastward or barricading their doors. The great West Fold, once Rohan's strong right arm, became a patchwork of scorched earth and abandoned watchtowers. Theodred, his cloak crusted with dried blood, stood one evening in the ruins of a mill, its wheel shattered by axes. The wind carried the stench of burnt hay, and with it, the laughter of orcs somewhere in the hills. He knelt, pressing his palm to the earth as if he could draw strength from it, and whispered the oath of Arel, not in defiance, but in desperation. Then came the storm, not of wind or rain, but of hoof beats. A single rider, his gray cloak whipping like a banner, his staff striking the stones of Edoras with a sound like a challenge. Gandalf's Stormcrow had returned. The guards at Meduseld's doors hesitated, their spears wavering, but the wizard did not wait for permission. He strode past them, his eyes burning in the dim hall, and faced the king. "Theoden, son of Thengel," he said, his voice cutting through the haze of smoke and whispers. "Too long have you sat in the shadows. The hour is late, but not too late for courage." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the king's breath hitched, his shoulders trembling, not with weakness, but with something long buried. Grima lunged forward, his voice a serpent's hiss. "You see how he torments you, Lord." But Theoden's hand gripped the armrest, his knuckles white. Slowly, as if waking from a dream, he lifted his head. Beyond the hall, beyond the walls, a horn sounded, deep and resonant, the call of the Rohirrim that had not been heard in too many seasons. The king's eyes met Gandalf's, and in them flickered the ghost of a man who had once led charges beneath the sun. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and turned earth. Somewhere in the distance, another horn answered the first. The plains of Rohan, so long silent, were waking. The horns of Edoras shattered the dawn, their voices raw and urgent as they called the riders of Rohan to war. Theoden stood in the courtyard, his armor catching the first light, no longer the broken man who had trembled in Meduseld's shadows. The wind carried the scent of burning thatch from distant farms, a cruel reminder of what was at stake. "Every sword, every spear," he commanded, his voice cutting through the murmurs of fear. "From the greenest boy to the grayest elder, if they can ride, they will ride." And so they came, farmers with scythes lashed to poles, shepherds with hunting bows, grandmothers who remembered Helm's winter and sharpened knives in the dark. The road to Helm's Deep was a river of dust and determination, the earth trembling beneath the weight of so many hooves. Aragorn, his cloak gray as the twilight, rode at Theoden's side, his eyes fixed on the jagged silhouette of the fortress ahead. "They will outnumber us 10-1, he said quietly. The king did not flinch. "Then we shall make each stroke count for 20. Behind them, Legolas and Gimli exchanged a glance, not of doubt, but of grim understanding. This was not a battle for glory. It was a battle for breath, for the right to see another sunrise. When the walls of Helm's Deep finally loomed before them, the air itself seemed to thicken with dread. The fortress, once a symbol of Rohan's strength, now felt like a last stand. Women and children huddled in the caves below, their whispers echoing like ghosts. Theoden dismounted, his boots sinking into mud churned by countless feet, and placed a hand on the cold stone. Helm's hand was strong. He murmured, as if the long-dead king might hear. "Let ours be stronger." The first arrows fell like black rain. Orcs, their ranks endless, surged forward with ladders and grappling hooks, their war cries drowning even the thunder of the defenders' drums. Gimli, perched atop the battlements, roared as he split a helmet with his axe. "That's one." Legolas' bowstring hummed, his arrows finding throats and eyes with deadly precision. "And that's 5, he countered, though his voice held no joy. Below, Aragorn and the Rohirrim fought shoulder to shoulder, their swords carving fleeting spaces of light in the suffocating dark. Hour after hour, the tide pressed closer. The deeping wall cracked under the weight of a battering ram, its stones groaning like a wounded beast. Theoden, his banner still flying, rallied his men at the gate, his sword slick with gore. "For your children," he shouted, his voice raw, "for the grass underfoot and the sky overhead, but even courage has its limits." As dawn's first glow tinged the eastern sky, the king allowed himself one terrible thought. This is how it ends. Then, a sound, not the clash of steel or the shriek of orcs, but a low, rolling thunder that made the very earth tremble. Aragorn, his face streaked with blood, turned toward the hills. "Do you hear it?" The wind shifted, carrying not the stench of battle, but the wild, clean scent of horses, and with it came the call of a horn. No Rohirrim could mistake the horn of Erkenbrand, its note clear and defiant. From the east, a tide of riders poured down the slopes, their spears glinting like a breaking wave. The dawn had brought not death, but deliverance. The orcs wavered, their ranks crumbling as the fresh horsemen plowed into their flanks. Theoden, his heart pounding like a war drum, swung onto his steed. "Now," he cried, and the gates burst open. The Rohirrim charged, not as desperate men, but as avengers, their fury sharpened by the long night's torment. Aragorn and the Fellowship surged with them, their blades cutting paths through the fleeing enemy. The battle was not yet won, but for the first time in hours, the word hope did not feel like a lie. As the sun climbed higher, its light spilled over Helm's Deep, painting the battered walls gold. The defenders, their arms heavy with exhaustion, watched the remnants of Saruman's army scatter like rats. Gimli wiped his brow, leaning on his axe. "I'll never doubt the strength of men again," he grunted. Legolas, his quiver empty, nodded silently, but it was Theoden who truly understood the cost. The bodies of the fallen lay thick upon the stones, their faces turned toward the sky they had died to keep free. This victory was not the end. It was a promise that Rohan, though bloodied, would never bow. The charge began not with a shout, but with the collective intake of breath, 1,000 riders bracing as one. Theoden raised his sword, its edge catching the newborn dawn, and the Rohirrim surged forward like a river unleashed. The ground trembled beneath their hooves, a living drumroll that drowned out the cries of the enemy. Yomer, his helm dented and his cloak torn, rode at the king's flank, his voice raw from a night of battle, yet still ringing clear. For the mark, he roared, and the answering cry shook the very stones of Helm's Deep. Saruman's forces, so confident in their numbers, wavered as the tidal wave of horsemen struck. Uruk high, their black armor gleaming with malice, found their formations shattered like glass beneath the weight of the charge. Spears splintered, shields cracked, and the air filled with the thunder of collapsing ranks. The Rohirrim did not merely fight, they carved, their blades writing a story of vengeance in the language of steel. Aragorn and Gimli, fighting side by side with the defenders, watched as the tide turned, their own weariness momentarily forgotten in the face of such fury. But victory, when it came, was not sweet. The fields before the fortress were littered with the fallen Rohirrim, who would never again feel the wind in their hair or hear the laughter of their children. Theoden dismounted beside a young rider, no older than 16, whose hand still clutched a broken spear. The king knelt, closing the boy's unseeing eyes with a gentleness that belied the battle's savagery. Their names will be remembered, he vowed, his voice thick. Everyone, in the aftermath, as the survivors tended wounds and gathered the dead, Yomer stood atop the deeping wall, his gaze sweeping the carnage. We've won the field, he said quietly, but Saruman's poison lingers. The White Wizard's influence had been broken here, yet the air itself seemed heavy with unspent malice. Theoden joined him, his armor streaked with dirt and blood. This was never just about Isengard, the king murmured. The shadow in the east grows darker by the hour. Gondor will need us soon. The words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Rohan's fate was now bound to the larger war. The riders who had fought at Helm's Deep would not rest long. Somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the Anduin's winding path, a storm was gathering, one that would demand not just courage, but unity. Theoden turned his face eastward, where the dawn's light had yet to reach. The horizon smoldered, not with fire, but with something far older. The battle for Middle-earth was only beginning, and so the horns of Rohan sounded once more, not in triumph, but in solemn promise. The riders would answer the call, not just for their land, but for all who stood against the coming night. The road to Gondor stretched long and shadowed, its winding path cutting through lands that had once been green and now lay hushed under a sickly twilight. Theoden rode at the head of his host, his cloak pulled tight against the wind that carried whispers of things unseen. 6,000 riders followed him, not just soldiers, but farmers, blacksmiths, and fathers who had kissed their children goodbye with the taste of uncertainty heavy on their tongues. The beacons of Gondor had burned bright in the night, their flames a silent scream for aid, and Rohan had answered, not out of obligation, but because the oath of Arel was not written on parchment. It was carved into the bones of every man and woman who called the mark home. Yet the journey was no triumphant march. Scouts returned with grim tidings, orc bands slinking through the Druiden forest, wargs prowling the foothills of the White Mountains, and worse, shadows that moved against the wind. Every night, the Rohirrim made camp with weapons close at hand, their fires kept low to avoid drawing eyes from the dark. Around those flickering flames, voices were hushed. Some spoke of the legends of the dead men who haunted the paths of the Dimhold, a shortcut through the mountains that none dared take. Others muttered of the Witch King's winged beasts, said to pluck riders from their saddles like an eagle snatching fish from a stream. Amidst the ranks rode a rider who drew no attention, their armor slightly too large, their helm tilted just so to obscure their face. Éowyn, niece to the king, had left her mourning gowns folded in Meduseld and taken up a sword instead. The weight of it at her hip was unfamiliar, but the fire in her chest was not. She had spent too many years standing at the threshold of halls where decisions were made, her voice unheeded because it came from lips deemed too fair for war. No longer, if the price of defiance was exile, she would pay it gladly so long as her blade found its mark before the end. The third night brought the first true test. A scouting party returned at a gallop, their horses lathered with sweat. Orcs, their leader, gasped, a host of them, blocking the road near the Firian wood. Theoden's jaw tightened. A detour would cost them days they did not have. Aragorn, who had ridden ahead with Legolas and Gimli, stepped forward. "There is another way," he said quietly, "though none but the dead have walked it in an age." The king's eyes flickered to the east, where the mountain passes loomed like a row of broken teeth, the paths of the dead. Even the bravest among the riders shifted uneasily at the name. Theoden closed his eyes, weighing the choice. To face the orcs was to risk annihilation. To take the haunted path was to gamble with the souls of his people. But Gondor was bleeding, and time was a blade at their throats. When he opened his eyes again, there was no hesitation. "We ride at dawn," he said, his voice carrying over the hushed camp. Let the shadows do their worst. As the first light touched the mountains, the Rohirrim turned their horses toward the dim hold, where the very air seemed to shudder with ancient malice. The ground grew steeper, the trees gnarled and clutching at their cloaks like beggars pleading for alms. At the mouth of the pass stood a single black stone, its surface etched with runes no living man could read. Aragorn dismounted, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "This is the threshold," he murmured. Beyond it, the Oathbreakers wait. Éowyn, her fingers tight around her reins, felt the breath of something unseen brush against her neck. The stories said the dead had sworn to fight for Gondor's king, and had fled instead, cursed to linger until their vow was fulfilled. She had always thought such tales were meant to frighten children. Now, as the wind howled through the canyon, like a chorus of lost voices, she wondered if the truth might be worse than the legend. Aragorn stepped forward, his voice cutting through the unnatural silence. "I summon you to fulfill your oath," the words echoed, bouncing off the stone walls until they seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the earth itself trembled, and a sound like 1,000 rattling bones filled the air. The Rohirrim's horses reared, their eyes rolling white with terror. Even Theoden's steed, battle-hardened and true, danced sideways, its nostrils flaring. Out of the darkness they came, shapes of mist and memory, their forms shifting between man and nightmare. The dead king stood before Aragorn, his hollow eyes burning with a light that held no warmth. "We fight for none but the heir of Isildur," he hissed, his voice the scrape of a blade on stone. Aragorn did not flinch. "Then fight," he said, "and be free." The host pressed forward, the living and the dead walking the same road for the first time in millennia. The air grew thicker with every step, as if the mountain itself resisted their passage. Éowyn kept her gaze fixed ahead, her pulse roaring in her ears. She She had longed for this, to stand where it mattered, to prove that courage was not bound by blood or birth. But here, in this place where time itself seemed frayed, she understood the true cost of defiance. The dead were not just a weapon, they were a warning. When at last they emerged from the darkness, the plains of Gondor stretched before them, golden under the afternoon sun. The dead lingered at the edge of the light, their forms flickering like candles in the wind. Aragorn turned to them, his face unreadable. "Your oath is fulfilled," he said. With a sound like a sigh, the shadows dissolved, their chains broken at last. Theoden drew his sword, the steel catching the sun as he pointed it toward the distant spires of Minas Tirith. Smoke rose from the Pelennor Fields, and the cries of battle carried on the wind. No speeches were needed. The Rohirrim knew what lay ahead. With a single, wordless cry, they urged their horses forward, not to the rescue of an ally, but to the defense of a world worth fighting for. Éowyn touched the hidden dagger at her wrist, her heart hammering against her ribs. The city of kings awaited, and with it, a reckoning. Let them say a woman's hand was too soft for war. She would show them how deeply it could cut. The earth shook beneath the hooves of 6,000 riders as they burst onto the Pelennor Fields, a wave of steel and fury, crashing into the flanks of Mordor's legions. The morning sun, pale and fragile behind the smoke, glinted off Theoden's raised sword as he led the charge, his voice raw with a cry that was less words than a force of nature: death. Ride to ruin and the world's ending. The Rohirrim answered with a roar that split the sky, their horses' nostrils flaring at the stench of orc flesh and burning pitch. The impact was catastrophic. Lances splintered against black armor, bodies tumbled beneath churning hooves, and for one breathless moment, the tide of battle hung suspended, then broke in Rohan's favor. But triumph is a fragile thing. From the swirling chaos rose a shadow taller than the rest, its tattered wings blotting out the sun. The Witch King of Angmar, his very presence leaching warmth from the air, turned his hollow gaze toward the king. Theoden's horse, Snowmane, reared in terror, then screamed as a black dart found its flank. The beast fell, and with it the king, pinned beneath his saddle, his armor crumpled like parchment. Yet even as the darkness closed in, his hand found the hilt of his sword. "I go to my fathers," he whispered, blood flecking his beard, "in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed." It was Éowyn who stepped between the Witch King and his prey, her sword trembling not with fear, but with the weight of a lifetime spent waiting for this moment. The creature laughed, a sound like bones grinding. "No living man may hinder me." She tore off her helm, her golden hair unspooling in the wind. "But no living man am I." The blade she swung was not her own. It was Merry's, the hobbit's small hands driving it deep into the wraith's knee, shattering the spell that held its form. And when Éowyn's stroke came, it was not with a warrior's grace, but with the desperate strength of one who has nothing left to lose. The Witch King's cry tore the sky asunder, his form unraveling like smoke in a gale. Across the field, Yomer's voice rose above the din, rallying the scattered riders. He had seen his sister fall, seen the king's banner dip, yet his command held no despair, only fire. To the king, to the king. The Rohirrim, bloodied but unbroken, locked shields around Theoden's body, their defiance a living wall. And as the last of Mordor's forces fled or fell, a strange quiet settled over the field. The air smelled of iron and trampled grass, of sweat and sacrifice. Yomer knelt beside his uncle, gently closing the old warrior's eyes. The crown of Rohan was his now, but the weight of it was not gold. It was the silence where a father's voice had been. Yet even in grief, there was light. The white city's gates creaked open, its defenders pouring out to meet their saviors. Aragorn clasped Yomer's forearm, his grip firm. "Your people have turned the tide," he said, though the words were inadequate for the debt owed. The Rohirrim, weary to their bones, lifted their heads at the sound of Gondor's horns, not in triumph, but in recognition. This was not the end. The war's true heart still beat in the east, where the dark tower loomed. As the sun dipped toward the white mountains, casting long shadows over the dead and the living alike, Éowyn stirred in the healing tents. Her arm was broken, her ribs a tapestry of bruises, but her spirit was unshackled at last. The prophecy had named her doom, and she had laughed in its face. Outside, the first stars pricked the twilight, and the wind carried the distant sound of riders singing the old lament for Theoden. Not a dirge, but a promise that the mark would endure, so long as one heart still remembered its name. The dawn would bring new battles, new choices, but for now, beneath the watchful gaze of the mountains, Rohan allowed itself a single, shuddering breath. The fields were won, the cost was counted, and somewhere beyond the horizon, the future waited. The golden hall of Meduseld had never shone brighter, its walls draped with banners that whispered in the warm summer breeze. Outside, the fields of Rohan stretched green and unbroken, the scars of battle hidden beneath new growth. Yet inside, the air hummed with something deeper than celebration, a quiet understanding that this day was not just about crowns, but about choices. Yomer stood before the high seat, his hands still rough from the grip of his sword, his sister Éowyn beside him with her arm in a sling, but her chin lifted high. The old laws demanded a king be crowned with the blessing of the people, and today, every voice from the Eastfold to the Westfold roared as one. When the silver circlet was placed upon his brow, Yomer did not flinch at its weight, though his first words were not of triumph, but of memory. "We do not inherit the land from our fathers," he said, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. "We borrow it from our children." The words were Theoden's, spoken long ago in a quieter time, and they hung in the air like a vow. Then, turning to Éowyn, he did something no king of Rohan had done before. He offered her a place not just at his side, but in the councils of war and peace. Her eyes, still shadowed from the Witch King's gaze, burned with a fierce light. The people murmured, but none dared protest. The shield maiden, who had broken doom itself, had earned more than a seat. She had rewritten the rules. The feast that followed was a tapestry of laughter and tears. Gondor's envoy, a gray-clad Faramir with eyes that lingered too long on Éowyn, raised a cup to the new king. "To the oath of Arel," he said, "and to the friendship that will outlast every shadow." Yomer drank deeply, then set his own cup aside and clasped Faramir's wrist. "Not just friendship," he corrected. "Family." The word settled over the hall like a promise. Outside, the wind carried the scent of apple blossoms from the orchards, a sweetness that had been absent for too many seasons. Yet for all the music and mead, the night was not without its ghosts. In a corner where the firelight flickered, an old rider traced the notches on his dagger, one for each comrade lost at Pelennor. Yomer noticed, and without a word, he knelt beside the man, pressing a fresh blade into his hand. "Carve new marks," he said softly, "for the living." The rider's throat worked, but when he nodded, the grip of his fingers spoke louder than any oath. Dawn found Yomer standing alone on the terrace, his crown discarded on a bench, his palms braced against the stone. Below him, Edoras stirred awake children, chasing chickens through the streets, smiths hammering fresh nails into rebuilt doors, a young girl humming as she wove a garland of meadow flowers. The weight of what lay ahead pressed upon him, the granaries to refill, the borders to patrol, the wounds of a kingdom that ran deeper than flesh. But then Éowyn's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp as a blade. "Brother," she said, tossing him an apple from the morning's harvest, "stop brooding. Even kings must eat." He caught it, the fruit firm and cool in his hand, and for the first time in months he laughed. The road ahead would be long. The orcs had been driven back, not destroyed, and the earth itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next storm. But for now, the sun rose over a land that remembered how to hope. Somewhere in the grass, a lark began to sing. The first seeds took root in the blackened soil of the West Fold, their tender green shoots a defiance against the memory of fire. Villages that had been reduced to skeletal timbers and ash now echoed with the steady rhythm of hammers as new homes rose from the ruins. Farmers, their hands still marked with the calluses of war, bent to the earth, not with swords, but with plowshares, turning the soil as if coaxing it to remember peace. Children who had hidden in caves now chased each other through half-built streets, their laughter weaving through the air like birdsong after a storm. Yet every evening, when the sun dipped behind the mountains, the people of Rohan gathered at the edges of their fields, not to mourn, but to light candles for those who had sown this future with their blood. Éowyn stood in the gardens of the Houses of Healing, her fingers brushing the petals of a white nifredil. The scent of Athelas clung to the air, its sweetness a balm to lungs that had breathed too much smoke and steel. Faramir, quiet as the dusk, often joined her there, speaking not of battles but of books, of the way the river Anduin caught the moonlight. At first, she had bristled at his gentleness, mistaking it for pity. But the day she found herself laughing at some foolish jest about a misplaced gardening spade, she realized the truth. Healing was not surrender. It was another kind of courage. Back in Edoras, Yomer walked the rebuilt streets, his crown less a weight now than a compass. The granaries were full again, the herds thick in the valleys, yet the true measure of Rohan's recovery lay in the small moments. The baker who slipped an extra loaf to a widow's child, the blacksmith who mended a neighbor's plow without charge. Still, shadows lingered in the corners of the kingdom. Old riders, their faces lined with too many winters, would pause at the sound of a distant horn, their hands drifting to absent swords. "They'll come back," muttered a grizzled farmer one evening, staring eastward where the mountains gnawed at the sky. Yomer, passing by, did not dismiss the fear. Instead, he knelt beside the man, pressing a cup of ale into his grip. "Then we'll meet them as we always have," he said, "together. Years unfurled like the banners over Meduseld, their passage marked not in battles, but in births and harvests, in the slow greening of scarred land." The great stallion Firefoot, once Yomer's war steed, grew fat and lazy in the royal pastures, his days of thunder replaced by the joy of children sneaking him apples. Yet even in peace, the Rohirrim remembered. On the anniversary of Pelennor, Riders would gather at sunrise, their saddles empty where fallen comrades should have sat, and let the wind carry their silence across the plains. Éowyn, visiting from her home in Ithilien, would walk the fields where she had once stood against the Witch King. The earth bore no mark of that clash, but her fingers still traced the old ache in her sword arm when the rains came. Faramir, ever at her side, knew better than to call it a weakness. Scars are just stories written in skin, he murmured one evening as she flexed her stiff fingers. She turned her hand in his, palm up, where a gardener's calluses now overlay the warriors. And some stories, she replied, are worth rewriting. The seasons turned, and Rohan flourished, not because the shadows were gone forever, but because its people had learned to plant hope, even in their presence. When strangers from distant lands rode into Edoras, marveling at the golden roofs and the laughter in the streets, the Rohirrim would raise their cups and tell them this: a kingdom is not built on stone or steel, but on the stubborn refusal to let the light fade. And as long as the grass grew and the rivers ran, that light would endure. The songs began at twilight, when the first stars pricked the sky, and the fires in Meduseld's hall cast long, dancing shadows. Bards plucked the strings of their harps, their voices weaving tales of Eorl the Young, his charge at Celebrant, still fresh in the collective memory of the plains. Children sat cross-legged on the rushes, their eyes wide as the singers conjured images of Helm Hammerhand, his fists like thunder in the snow, and Theoden King, who rose from shadows to lead his people into dawn. The melodies were more than entertainment. They were threads in the tapestry of Rohan's soul, stitching past to present with every note. Yomer, leaning against a carved pillar, watched the youngest listeners clutch wooden swords to their chests, their faces alight with the same fire that had once burned in his own heart. Tradition was not just about remembering, it was about kindling. Later, when the hall had emptied and the torches guttered low, he summoned the scribes. "Write it all down," he said, tracing the runes on a weathered shield with his fingertips. Not just the victories, but the winters, the choices, the cost. His father had taught him that a king's duty was to the future as much as the past. Yet outside the hall, the world was shifting. Traders from Dale brought news of distant lands where machines clattered and smoke belched from iron towers. Even in Gondor, the age of the horse lords seemed to some a relic, charming but out of step with the new order. Éowyn, visiting from Ithilien, had seen it firsthand. "They speak of progress," she told her brother one evening as they walked the ramparts, as if progress means forgetting how to hear the wind. The tension was subtle, but it lingered, like the scent of rain before a storm. Some of the younger riders, eager for change, whispered that Rohan should trade their spears for plows, their herds for mills. An old captain, his beard streaked with gray, spat into the fire at the suggestion. "The day we forget who we are," he growled, "is the day the mark falls." Yomer knew the truth lay somewhere in between. That spring, he ordered the training fields expanded, not just for warriors, but for healers, diplomats, and builders. The horse must run, he declared at the first council of the new age, but it must also know when to walk. The compromise pleased neither traditionalists nor reformers, but it held a deeper wisdom. Adaptation was not surrender. The spirit of the mark would endure, not by clinging to the past like a drowning man to a rock, but by carrying its lessons forward like a torch into the dark. On clear nights, when the stars blazed over Edoras, travelers would pause on the road to listen. From the open windows of Meduseld, the songs still rose of Eorl's ride, of Helm's stand, of Theoden's awakening. But now, mingled with the old verses, were new ones, of a kingdom that had faced the storm and chosen to rebuild, not just its walls, but its heart. And high above, the same constellations that had guided the first riders still shone, their light a promise that some things, courage, memory, home, would never fade. The first meeting between Yomer and King Elessar after the war was not in a grand hall or atop a battlefield, but on the windswept plains where the borders of Rohan and Gondor blurred into golden grass. No banners flew, no heralds announced their presence, just two kings, their horses grazing side by side as they spoke of roads to mend and bridges to rebuild. Aragorn's laughter rang out when Yomer handed him a flask of Rohan's sharpest mead, the taste sparking memories of shared campfires and bloodied swords. You'd think ruling would be quieter than fighting, Yomer mused, wiping his mouth. Aragorn's smile faded only slightly. The battles change, the vigilance doesn't. And so it began. Every season, their councils grew longer, sometimes in Minas Tirith's marble chambers, sometimes under the open sky of Edoras. Scholars from Gondor brought scrolls on agriculture, teaching the Rohirrim how to coax wheat from stubborn soil, while Rohan's horse masters shared their secrets of breeding steeds that could outrun the wind. Trade caravans now snaked along the Great West Road, their wagons heavy with Gondorian steel and Rohirrim wool, their guards more likely to share ale than draw blades. In the markets of Aldburg, children gaped at Gondorian clockwork toys, and in the taverns of Lossarnac, minstrels sang of Eorl's charge with fresh verses about Pellennor's tide-turning ride. Yet not every heart embraced the new age. In the dim corners of Rohan's mead halls, grizzled warriors muttered into their cups, "Next they'll tell us to trade our saddles for scribes' quills." One grumbled, his hand flexing as if missing the weight of an axe. Even in Gondor, nobles who'd never ridden farther than their vineyards sneered at the horse lords as relics of a wilder time. The tension simmered, harmless as a banked fire, until the day a Gondorian merchant was found beaten in Edoras, his pockets slit and his goods stolen. The culprit, a rider's son, spat at Yomer's feet. "They take our land with smiles now instead of swords." The trial that followed became legend. Yomer stood before his people, not atop the high seat, but in the dust of the square, the accused boy trembling before him. "You think this is loyalty?" the king asked, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmurs. "Theoden died for a world where no child fears the shadow. Shall we now become the shadow?" The boy wept as he was sentenced to repay the merchant in labor, but it was Yomer's next act that stilled the crowd. He stripped off his own cloak, clasping it around the merchant's shoulders. "Harm to one is harm to all. This is the Mark's law now." That night, beneath a sky thick with stars, Yomer and Aragorn climbed the ramparts of Helm's Deep, the ancient stones humming with memory. The younger king broke the silence first. They fear losing who they are. Aragorn's gaze was fixed eastward, where the darkness had once gathered, and you. Yomer's answer was a blade unsheathed in moonlight. "I fear losing what we fought for." Their clasped hands sealed the unspoken vow, not just between kings, but between realms. Let the doubters whisper. The future would be written by those who dared to bridge the past. Years flowed like the Entwash after thaw, carrying away old grudges like dead leaves. The scholar from Gondor, who once stumbled over Rohirrim phrases, now taught his daughter to ride. The rider's son, who'd stolen, became a guard on the very caravans he despised. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the world held its breath, the sentries on both borders no longer watched for threats from one another, but stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes on the horizon where the first light would rise. Unity, they'd learned, was not the absence of conflict. It was the choice, again and again, to face the storm as one. The land bore witness. Orchards heavy with fruit now grew where armies had clashed. Children who'd never known war played in the ruins of old watchtowers, their laughter weaving through the stones like a spell of renewal. And high above, the same eagles that had once borne tidings of doom now circled peacefully, their shadows fleeting over a kingdom. No, 2 kingdoms that had learned the hardest lesson of all, that peace, like a good harvest, required not just planting, but tending. The wind carried the scent of snow from the mountains, though the fields below still shimmered gold in the late afternoon light. Yomer, his hair now white as the peaks of the misty mountains, leaned heavily on the saddle horn as Firefoot, once a fiery stallion, now gray-muzzled and steady, picked his way along the familiar path. They moved slowly, not from weakness, but from the weight of memory. Every hill, every bend in the river, whispered with the voices of those who had ridden beside him long ago. Theoden, whose laughter had been like summer thunder. Éowyn, her defiance as sharp as her sword. Aragorn, his friendship forged in the fires of war. The king's fingers trembled, not from age, but from the fullness of it all. Elfwine, his son, rode a pace behind, silent as the shadows lengthening across the grass. The young man's eyes, so like his mother's, flickered between the horizon and his father's bowed shoulders. He had been raised on stories of Rohan's glory, but the crown awaiting him felt less like an honor and more like a debt. "They will compare me to you," he had confessed the night before, his voice tight. Yomer had turned, the firelight carving deep lines into his face. "No," he said. "They will compare you to the man you choose to be." At the crest of the hill, Yomer dismounted, his knees protesting as he knelt to press his palm into the earth. The soil was warm, alive with the hum of insects and the faint tremor of distant hooves. This was the place where Arel had first pledged his oath, where Theoden had rallied his riders before the Black Gate, where generations of kings had come to remember why the mark was worth bleeding for. When Yomer spoke, his voice was rough but clear. "The land does not belong to us, boy. We belong to it. Rule it lightly, but defend it fiercely." The ride back to Edoras was quiet, the only sound the creak of leather and the sigh of the wind through the grass. By the time they reached the gates, torches flickered in the gathering dusk, their light pooling like liquid gold on the stones of Meduseld. Inside, the hall was hushed, the usual clamor of feasting stilled. The lords of the mark stood in a half-circle, their faces unreadable. Elfwine's hand hovered near his sword, not in threat, but in readiness, for this moment, for the burden about to settle on his shoulders. Yomer did not ascend the dais. Instead, he unbuckled his sword belt, the blade that had tasted orc blood and saved kingdoms, and laid it across his son's outstretched arms. "A king's first duty," he murmured, "is to know when to let go." Then, with a grin that chased the shadows from the hall, he added, "And his second is to trust his horse." The laughter that followed was a balm, a bridge between the old and the new. That night, as the stars wheeled overhead, Yomer stood on the terrace one last time. The plains stretched before him, vast and whispering, and for a heartbeat, he could almost hear the echo of countless hoofbeats, the songs of riders long dust. His breath fogged the air, then stilled. Dawn found Elfwine alone on the walls, his father's cloak wrapped tight against the chill. Below, the first light gilded the rooftops of Edoras, the pastures, the distant ribbon of the snowborn. Somewhere, a lark began to sing. The crown on his brow was heavier than he'd imagined, but the wind carried something else now. Not an ending, but a beginning. The mark would endure. It always had. Elfwine's coronation was not marked by the clang of swords or the roar of battle. It began with silence. The great hall of Meduseld stood hushed as the young king lifted the ancient crown of Rohan, its gold worn smooth by generations of rulers before him. The weight of it was more than metal. It was the unspoken expectation of a people who had bled for their land and now looked to him to keep it safe. Yet when he spoke, his voice carried neither uncertainty nor arrogance, but the quiet steadiness of a man who had learned to listen, to the wind over the plains, to the elders by the fire, even to the whispers of the past that lingered in the very stones of Edoras. "I will not rule as my father did," he declared, "nor as his father before him. A tree that does not bend with the wind breaks." The first test came not from orcs or invaders, but from the earth itself. A drought settled over the Eastfold, withering crops and turning rivers to dust. Where older kings might have sent riders to demand tribute from neighboring lands, Elfwine called together farmers, well diggers, and even Gondorian engineers who had studied the canals of Lossarnac. Together, they carved new channels from the mountains, diverting snowmelt to the parched fields. When the first shoots of barley pushed through the cracked soil, the people did not cheer for their king. They cheered with him, their hands as calloused as his from the labor. Yet peace, as Yomer had often warned, was not the absence of conflict, but the readiness to face it. Scouts brought word of strange riders beyond the Isen, men with no banners but eyes sharp as hawks. The council urged war, the memory of the Dunlendings' betrayal still bitter in their mouths. Elfwine rode out alone to meet them, his only armor a cloak, and the weight of his father's sword at his hip. What passed between them under the oaks of the Firian wood was never fully known, but when he returned, the strangers rode with him, not as prisoners, but as allies sworn to guard the gap of Rohan. "A spear kept in the hand grows heavy," he told his people, "but a spear laid down may be taken up again when needed." The years unfolded like the pages of a well-worn saga, each chapter a balance of plowshare and sword. Elfwine rebuilt the watchtowers along the Anduin, not as barracks, but as way stations where travelers could find shelter and news. He welcomed dwarven stonemasons to strengthen the walls of Edoras, their hammers ringing alongside Rohirrim laughter. Yet in the armories, the smiths still worked, their forges burning bright through the night. The king himself would often walk among them, testing the balance of a new blade or the fit of a reforged helm. "For the storm that does not come today," he would say, "may still rise tomorrow." When the final illness came upon him, Elfwine did not retreat to the shadows as Theoden had in his dark years. He sat in the sunlight of Meduseld's terrace, his grandchildren at his feet, and told them not of his victories, but of his doubts, the nights he had lain awake weighing decisions, the times he had wondered if his father would have approved. "A king who fears mistakes," he murmured, stroking the braid of a giggling toddler, will never dare to do what is right. The day they laid him beside his ancestors in the barrows, the wind carried an unexpected sound, the laughter of children playing in the fields where his reforms had once saved the harvest. The songs sung that night were not dirges, but the same riding chants that had echoed under Eorl's banners, under Helm's fists, under Theoden's last charge. The words had not changed, but the voices that carried them had, deeper, richer, woven through with the threads of a kingdom that had learned to bend without breaking. High above, the eagles still circled, their wings brushing the same sky that had watched over Rohan's first sunrise. Some things, after all, were eternal. The horns that sounded that day were unlike any heard in the Mark, for centuries older than the stones of Edoras, deeper than the roots of the White Mountains. They called from the east, not in words, but in a resonance that stirred something long dormant in the blood of every Rohirrim descendant. The villagers of the fold whispered of dreams, riders in gray cloaks, gathering under a moonless sky, their saddles empty, their spears glinting with frost that never melted. When the last living heir of Eorl's line, a woman with fire in her veins and silver in her braid, mounted her horse at dawn, she did so without a summons. She simply knew, as the earth knows when the seasons turn. They rode not as an army, but as echoes, a scattered handful of farmers, blacksmiths, and shepherds, their weapons heirlooms from forgotten battles. The old chronicles spoke of such things, the oath-bound, who answered when the world's need outweighed memory. A child threw a garland of evergreen at the hooves of the leading stallion. It did not wither as they passed. The air smelled of lightning and time, though the sky was clear. What they faced beyond the Dimhold has no name in any tongue still spoken. The scribes of Gondor would later dismiss the accounts as fable, a storm of shadows, a sound like 1,000 swords breaking. But the shepherds in the foothills told a different tale. They swore they saw a light flicker in that distant pass, brief as a struck spark, and heard a cry that was neither triumph nor despair, but something purer, the unyielding note of a horn blown at day's end. When the sun rose, the riders were gone. No bodies littered the road, no banners marked their fall. Only the grass bore witness, bent in swirling patterns where no foot had trod. The people of the Mark searched for years, turning over every stone, whispering names into the wind. But the truth, as the eldest among them murmured, was simpler. The Rohirrim had always been more than flesh. They were the thunder of hooves, the scent of rain on dry soil, the defiant shout that answers darkness. Generations later, when the last scrolls of Rohan crumbled to dust, and even Gondor's towers were worn to nubs by the wind, travelers would still pause at the edge of the plains. They couldn't say why the hair rose on their necks, or why their horses pricked their ears at nothing. But sometimes, when the twilight blurred the line between earth and sky, they'd hear it, a distant rhythm, steady as a heartbeat. And though they rode on, something in them stood a little straighter, as if an unseen hand had passed them a torch they couldn't drop. The world forgets kings. It forgets wars, but it does not forget courage. The ground shook as if the earth itself could no longer bear the weight of the coming storm. 6,000 riders of Rohan, their cloaks stained with the dust of hard roads, and their eyes sharp with the fire of those who have already sworn their lives away, tightened their grips on worn reins. At their head, a king no longer young but unbent, raised a sword that caught the first pale light of dawn. No speeches were bellowed, no final words of wisdom, just a name roared into the wind like a challenge to the sky, death. And then the world dissolved into thunder. Hooves struck the earth in a rhythm older than kingdoms, a pulse that had carried Eorl's people from the frozen north to these golden plains. The enemy's ranks, vast and bristling with steel, wavered for just an instant, not at the sight of blades, but at the sound. The Rohirrim did not ride to victory. They rode through it as a river carves through stone, inevitable, relentless, singing as they went. A farmer's son, his first beard barely grown, drove his spear into the throat of a troll and died laughing. A grandmother, her braids streaked with gray, swung a cleaver meant for butchering lambs and took a chieftain's head instead. This was not battle as the poets would later tell it. Clean lines and glorious strokes. This was the work of wolves, of survivors, of people who had long since stopped counting the cost. And then, the moment that would live in the marrow of every storyteller's bones. The king's banner dipped. A shadow, winged and terrible, plunged from the smoke-choked sky. Theoden King, pinned beneath his dying horse, looked up into the face of the Witch King of Angmar and did not flinch. What passed between them was not fear, but recognition, two old warriors measuring the weight of a lifetime's choices. The Nazgul's mace rose, and then a flash of silver. A cry that split the air like a lightning strike. I am no man. History would remember the blade that found its mark, the darkness that unraveled into shrieking wind. But the riders who survived would speak of something else, the way the grass, trampled and bloodied, sprang back greener where the king fell, the way the wind carried the scent of apple blossoms from some far-off orchard, as if the land itself were mourning. Most of all, they would remember the silence that followed, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something unspoken. The charge had broken the enemy, yes, but it had also fulfilled an older promise, one etched into every stone of Edoras, that so long as one rider drew breath, the mark would never kneel. The songs would call it a last stand. The survivors knew better. It was a beginning. Years later, when children asked why the banners still flew at half-mast on that day, their elders would point not to the graves, but to the fields where wildflowers bloomed in patterns that looked, from a distance, like galloping horses. The names of the fallen might fade, but the earth remembered, and somewhere beyond the edge of sight, where the horizon blurred into legend, the thunder of hooves never truly ceased. The fire in Meduseld burns low now, its embers casting a soft glow over the faces of the children gathered on the woven rugs. The storyteller's voice has faded, but the silence that follows is far from empty. It hums with the echoes of hoofbeats, the ghostly whispers of riders long gone, and the unshakable presence of a land that remembers. One small girl, her fingers still clutching the edge of her blanket, glances toward the hall's great doors, half expecting to see the shadow of a king stride through. Her brother, older but no less wide-eyed, traces the carvings on the wooden bench beside him, a horse mid-gallop, its mane frozen in perpetual motion. These are not just stories to them. They are heirlooms, passed down like the weight of a sword or the warmth of a cloak on a winter's night. Outside, the wind moves through the grass like an invisible hand, combing through gold. It carries with it the scent of distant rain, of turned earth in the fields where new crops grow over old battlefields. The children do not know it yet, but this is the true magic of Rohan, not just the glory of its past, but the quiet, stubborn way it refuses to be forgotten. The tapestries on the walls may fade, the songs may grow softer with each retelling, but the land itself holds the memory. Walk the plains at dusk, and you might still hear it, the faintest echo of a horn call, the vibration of hooves buried deep in the soil. The storyteller rises, her joints creaking like the timbers of an old ship, and blows out the last candle. The hall darkens, but the children do not stir. They are caught somewhere between dream and waking, where the riders of legend blur with the faces of their own fathers and sisters. One boy, his voice barely louder than the rustling of the fire's last sparks, asks the question that lingers in all their hearts. Will we have to be brave like that? The old woman pauses, her hand resting on the door frame. When she answers, it is not with words, but with a gesture, a palm pressed to the wooden beam where generations of kings have laid their hands. The answer is there, in the grain of the wood, in the scent of hay and horse flesh, in the way the wind still sings through the eaves. The children leave in pairs, their footsteps light on the stone steps, their heads full of fire and shadow. Behind them, Meduseld stands silent, its golden roof dull under the stars. But if you listen closely, just as the last ember winks out, you might hear it, the whisper of a lullaby older than the hall itself, carried on a breeze that has crossed 1,000 leagues of grassland. It tells no new tales, it needs none, for the story of Rohan was never just about kings or battles. It was about the child who tends the hearth, the farmer who mends the fence, the rider who watches the horizon. It was and is, and will always be, the story of a people who looked at the wild and called it home. The plains stretch on, endless under the moon. Somewhere, a horse snickers in its sleep. The wind rises again, and the grass bends low, as if bowing to an unseen crown. Tomorrow, the sun will climb over the white mountains, and the children will wake, some to tend flocks, some to practice with wooden swords, all of them carrying a spark they cannot yet name. But tonight, just for tonight, the air is thick with ghosts, and every dreaming soul in Edoras rides beneath the same banner.